Boom, I'm recording as well. Hi, everybody. Hey, Julia, just came in somewhere. All right. Well, this is week 7, and we have one more week. Oh, someone else wants in. We have one more week, and then no, it disappeared. We have one more week, and then we break for midterm, so that's good. All right. I wanted to start by having a little look at the exercise that you did, not this week, but the week before, that I graded for you, which I have to say, 99% of you did a very good job on. It was not easy to go from sort of thinking about things in general to really looking at things in specific. But this is sort of the job. If you are given a pronunciation course, this is the kind of work that you want to do with all your learners in terms of an assessment. So remember that we didn't talk about her suprasegmentals because we haven't done that yet. So we were really totally focused on consonants, vowels, linking, and epenthetic. So throughout the reading, she had incredible amounts of epenthetic schwas, right? They appeared at the beginning of words, they appeared at the end of the words, they appeared all over the place. So that was a real problem. And also throughout the whole reading, there was virtually no linking. There was a lot of like individual citation forms. So then she had a number of problems with her word stress, which I've put there, which didn't always include the Spanish version. So effective was one of her where she'd shifted the stress to the front of the word. She had problems with the morphemic endings that we're going to look at today. Stressed, washed, confirmed. Then she had a whole host of vowel problems, right? Now this is, remember when we said back, I think in week 3 or 4, vowels are crucial. Vowels are the thing that's gonna blow it for your learners if they're really badly off. Like if you hadn't had the text to read, you wouldn't have known that she was saying goose, right? I mean, it literally sounded, if anything, like ghost, maybe, but you would not have been able to get that. So there were a number of really big problems there that I would have spent some serious time on, even though, you know, that's the more tricky part of an analysis. She also had some problems with some consonants, but compared to the problems that she had with the vowels, this was pretty lightweight actually. So although it's easier in some ways to focus on consonant activities than vowels, I would with this chick start totally with vowels, and I would have started totally with a pedagogical chart and taken her through the vowel chart. Now, a couple of things. A number of you were very quick to base everything on the L1. Some of you, because you're very familiar with the L1. Now, that's important to notice that there are, and there's a reason that we tell you what the L1 is, because there's likely to be a certain set of errors. But it doesn't automatically assume that she's going to have every error that might be demonstrated by a Spanish speaker, or a particular error that might be demonstrated by a Spanish speaker. For example, you've got a wide variety of Spanish dialects. So some people, depending upon whether they're from Argentina or Mexico or different places, will have slightly different issues, particularly with vowels. Um, and in this case, although the L1 actually is Spanish, and it says that in the IDEA archive, it says this person's L1 is Spanish, it may be that in many circumstances their L1 is not the lingua franca language, but an indigenous first language, right? So if you look for Indian English speakers, for example, which I look at, you know, you'll have a Tamil speaker versus a Hindi speaker, and although they've been speaking English since they were the same age, they will have some different errors based on the combination of Tamil and English versus a northern language like Punjabi or Indian or Hindi and English. So don't assume that you're going to get a certain amount of things. However, what it can do is once you've done the assessment without saying to yourself, this is a Spanish speaker, and so I'm going to find this, 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 and this. Because there were some things that she didn't show, like her V's were very good for veterinary and so on. But then you can go back and use a book like the one we talked about. I forget who asked me about this, but someone asked me about this. You can use a book like Teaching American English Pronunciation and look at their Spanish section. And you'll find that she had quite a lot of L1 influence things. So she had the y versus j in yellow, and I forget the other one, but all of you got that one. The s versus the z in zoo, which sounded like Sue, right? The voice and voiceless theta, she says either instead of ether, right? The ID endings we just looked at, stressed, washed, confirmed. She had some tense and lax vowels problems that we would expect, the E. And then she did often shift that stress for Spanish speakers, often shift that stress to the second to last syllable. So if we go back and have a look at those veterinary, she said, which is a classic example of that kind of shift. Unsanitary is that kind of instead of unsanitary. So, but then she also had other ones that didn't demonstrate that that pattern. So it can be helpful to go through this and have a look afterwards. But it's important that you start by doing your analysis, because there was also a lot of other ones that, for example, if you looked in that book, wouldn't pop up particularly. Particularly, there was a lot of confusion between diphthongs and monophthongs, right? Which is the reason that we had this ghost goose thing. So there were other diphthongs like I in kite instead of kit, right? So there was also some confusion about central vowels that wouldn't, you know, she had a central, yeah, in duck for Duke and tune, right? She had a central vowel there and a central vowel in strucking instead of stroking. So there were additional issues that you wouldn't have found in necessarily in a online or a written analysis of what happens with Spanish speakers. So it is important that you start with your analysis, try and start without any preconceptions, write out your entire analysis, and then you can go back to look for support. But I think you would probably agree in this case that the vowels were the significant issue. So I think a good start, because those vowels were not just the I and the tense lacs, but also a confusion between the central vowels, then a confusion between the diphthongs and the monophthongs. I just go right back to the beginning with this chick and go over the pedagogical vowel chart and go over some activities and start working in the different things. And then for a bit of light relief, do some consonant work, because that wasn't too awful. I mean, it was obvious, but it wasn't too awful in terms of unintelligibility. Now, of course, she also had a massive problem with her suprasegmentals, which we'll talk about later. But as one person noticed, I only asked you to do the reading, but at least one person kept listening, and her interactive, you know, when she was telling her story, it was much better than her reading. So obviously, there are activities that you could do to improve that. But hopefully that gives you a sense of how that might work. Did anyone that's online now have any other questions? But I gave you this feedback with your thing, but did anyone have any other questions or things that they wanted to ask about that assessment?
I do, Dr. Pickering. It's Julia.
Yeah, hi Julia.
So, hi, Dr. Pickering. So I think I overheard you say that when we look at the when we're like listening or looking at the analysis, we want to just go ahead and I think I wrote it down. We need to write out our entire analysis before we look for support. Right? Okay, and support is like things in our textbook that support our answer, or
yes. So now this might be I'm not sure if your textbook actually does this. Does your textbook does your textbook have an appendix? So by support, Julia, what I'm talking about is there are some pan L1 features. So if you're a French speaker, you will often do X when you speak English. And it's one of the reasons why we can sometimes guess whether someone's a German speaker of English or a French speaker of English or so on. So those features that come up all the time are called pan L2 features. So all French speakers probably do X in English. Now,
so it's L2, right? Pan L2 features.
Yeah, well, sorry, the transfer of L1 to L2 features.
Okay.
A particular kind of transfer so for example, French speakers have very nasal and very rounded vowels. So it's like, okay. So when they do back rounded vowels, they often come out very, so they often come out shorter and very rounded. Now, that is a typical pan feature for French speakers of English, but it doesn't necessarily mean all French speakers of English are going to do it, right? So what you want to do is first assess. So what some people do, because they don't trust their own ear, is they say, let me go to a book, to an appendix or a textbook that tells me what all the problems are for French speakers of English, okay? And then they use that to help. So I don't even think there is one in is there an appendix of that? No, you see, I think your book has decided to stay away from pattern features, because the problem with them is that then you hear those, but you might not hear anything else, right?
Oh, so it's kind of like a biased analyzation.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's in fact a much better way to put it. It's a bias instead of looking at it, listening to it properly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, once you've identified the features, listening it to yourself, you can then go back and have a look at some of, now there's nothing in your textbook, but this book, which I had put up on another day, which is Teaching American English Pronunciation, does have a section where it says Spanish speakers will do this, French speakers will do this. Okay, so then you can look at things like this to confirm. some of them and see what kind of activities they suggest. But you should always
Okay.
start by doing your own analysis. Now,
Okay.
I will say too, sorry, Julia, you've started me on a roll now. For those of you who are second language speakers, I was spent some time talking to Rennie, who's a Hungarian speaker. These pan features can be slightly more helpful on the basis that you might not be as good at hearing what's happening because you're also an L2 speaker. So they can be a nice way to, the more practice you do as an L2 speaker analyzing other L2 speakers, the better you will get. But in order to scaffold you to do that, often those kinds of pan feature lists can be helpful because you can actually be listening for something that you think might be there. But none of this stops the fact that the best thing is for you to keep practicing doing the assessments, because the more that you listen, I promise you, the more that you listen, the easier it gets. It just does. It's one of those things. Now, as I said to Rennie, the reason I don't do a lot of activities where your grade entirely depends on this kind of IPA transcription and identification work is because it's some of you are second language speakers and it's more difficult. So I don't want to penalize you for doing that. However, that is going to be part of your job as a pronunciation teacher. So you do want to keep practicing. This was just to try and give you an idea of how you might practice doing that with segmentals, and then we'll do it again with super segmentals. Well, Julia, that was probably a lot more than you were hoping for, but does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. That was helpful.
Good, good.
Dr.
Ari, yeah.
I have a question. Okay,
Yeah.
so I am one of the L2 speakers, and I would love to do this, tons of exercise, something like this. I was like, I couldn't catch this, but now I hear it, and then now that I know the answer, and then, oh yeah, she's doing that.
Well, Ari, if you want to do more,
yes.
I'm here. If you want to pick another idea archive, this applies to any of you. I mean, while you're doing this class and you want to do some practice,
Yes.
you'll have to do a set of lesson plans. I think I have you do a set of lesson plans, right? You have, I think one of your things is a set of lesson plans. So Ari, if you decided, for example, you want to do a set of lesson plans based on, features of Japanese English, Chinese English, or whatever, take some idea archive material like we just did with the Spanish speaker and do that transcription exercise and check in with me. And then what you would do would base your lesson plans that you created, your pronunciation lesson plans, on that transcription, right? So if you took 2 Japanese speakers, 2 Chinese, and 2 something else, or something like that, it doesn't have to, whatever you want. You could take, if they have 5 Japanese speakers, you could take 5 Japanese speakers and say, well, between these 5, I'm going to get most of what I'm likely to hear, plus any idiosyncratic features I'm likely to hear, i.e. from just 1 learner or 2 learners. So then use that. That's a great way to A, practice, and B, build your lesson plans on something valid. So, and then the first thing you would do would be to check with me that you and I agreed on your assessment. So if it floats your boat, Eric, go ahead, do some more. I'd be more than happy to work on the assessment with you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pickering.
You're very welcome. It's sort of interesting. I promise you, it's sort of frustrating at the beginning in many ways, but the more you do it, the more interesting it gets. Yeah. I promise. I don't even know how people grade writing and assess writing. It drives me crazy. This stuff actually makes me really interested. But all right, good job, everyone. Please do let me know if you've got any other questions, but that's certainly, if you want to keep doing it, do it. I'd be more than happy to work with you on it. All right, so this was actually a pretty short chapter, so we should be able to deal with this pretty quickly. This is the second in the three where we're looking at phonology as a whole and how it interacts with other systems. So the first one was listening, and the last one next week will be writing. God help us all. And this middle one is morphology. So the materials for this week are the PowerPoint that you're looking at. You've got a reading, post, and activity again. And the activity is based on a PDF written by a colleague and a very good friend of mine, John Murphy, who has been a pronunciation teacher for a gazillion years and is now, was teaching at Georgia State, is now retired and does, he's a yoga teacher, and apparently as part of his yoga teaching, he does naked yoga for men. So I don't even really want to think about what that's like, but he's a lovely guy. All right. So what does the phonology morphology boundary include? It basically, in the same way, the boundary you've heard, which is probably morphosyntax, is the interaction or the boundary between syntax and morphology. It's the exact same way with phonology. So the boundary between morphology and phonology is called morphophonology, right? So it's concerned with how morpheme concatenation, or how when you join two things together, two morphemes together, how that affects the interface between the system. So for example, one morpheme is cat, and another morpheme is s for plural. So what happens when you put cat plus s? What happens with the pronunciation? Well, in the case of cat plus s, you get what you'd expect, which is cats, right? But in the case of if it was a voice sound at the end, so dog, you get dog plus the morpheme s, which is the plural, but that changes when they come together. That becomes dogs with a z sound because of progressive assimilation, right? The G is voiced, and that affects the following S. So that's the interaction, and that's what we're looking at, this blending, when the two things blend together and what happens to them. Okay, so let's do a quick review of morphology. Which so by this I mean I'm not doing all of morphology, right? You've done morphology in 555, I assume, in 501, so you know about bound morphemes and free morphemes and all the rest of it. The only morpheme things that we're going to look at are the difference between inflectional morphemes and derivational morphemes, which I know you've also done, but I thought we'd do a quick review. So inflectional morphemes are also called grammatical morphemes because these change the grammar, right? And in English, we only have 8 of them. It's very handy to, because it's very easy. So, and several of them are the same phonological features. So they do the same things to the word. So for example, we have 3 different kinds of grammatical S's, right? We have the plural S, we have the possessive S, and we have the third person singular S, okay? So because it doesn't matter that they're different grammatical features, because they're the same phoneme, they're all S's, they're going to do the same thing at the morpheme boundary, right? We then have 2 ids, right? We have the past tense id and the past participle id, right? So again, they're going to do the same thing at the boundaries. We have the present participle ing, And then we have a comparative and a superlative est. And that's it for our grammatical morphemes. Yay us. It's one of the more straightforward things about English. So because they're always the same, oh, and so the second kind is derivational morphemes. So these are, in other words, every other morpheme. So these are all the morphemes that don't change the grammar, but do change the meaning. So for example, all affixation, prefixes, suffixes, and compounding as well. So happy to unhappy, possible to impossible, I have a greenhouse to I have a greenhouse. Okay, so those are the things that we're going to have a look at what happens when you push those morphemes up against the phonology, because it's systemic, right? So again, when we're going to start with grammatical morphemes, because that's what your book spends 90% of its time on, which is good. Because morphophonology is conditioned by sound, the phonology doesn't differentiate between the different morphemes if they're comprised of the same sound. Okay, so that means, as I said, it doesn't matter if the sound is changing because it's a plural S, or because it's a possessive S, or because it's a third person S. The result is always the same because it's always that underlying phoneme, right? So that is never going to change. The allophones of that phoneme, whether it's s, z, or z, are always going to be the same regardless of the grammatical category. So those are given for you. It wasn't sort of worth me rewriting this table. So if you want to go to 395, these CDs at the back of this book are very annoying, because I don't even have a CD player anymore. Do you guys have a CD player anymore? Oh, you do? Oh yeah, I don't. I was like, oh, I should probably listen to some of these CDs, and I'm like, I don't even have a CD player anymore. So not in my computer or anything. 395. So 395 and table 11.1, you can see those rules, and we've sort of looked at those before. They shouldn't be, and you should have had some introduction to this in either 501 or 555. So either way, you should, it shouldn't look too complicated, but basically it's a very simple system. The overarching phoneme is S, and it will change to different allophones depending upon its environment. So if it comes after a voiceless sound, you will get the S sound. If it comes after a voice sound, you get the Z sound. And if it comes after a sibilant, you'll get the Z or the Z sound. So the, the Z or the uz or the is sound, they're both voice. So sibilant consonants are given to you in the list on number 1, higher on that page. S, z, sh, j, ch, j. Okay, so those are the ones that are going to cause that shift to having a whole little mini syllable right there. Excuse me. So there are examples throughout your table and throughout this discussion on page 395. The most common problem is usually the addition of the "s", like people want to do it everywhere. You know, bags instead of bags and so on. So they want to do that ending even when there is no sibilant. So this is a good one to have on the wall of the classroom. I used to have it on the wall of the classroom where I just have 3 big pieces of cardboard with huge IPA letters in there, which would just be S, Z, and then the is or the is, right? And so when someone made that mistake, I wouldn't even recast. I wouldn't even re-say it. I would just go point to the thing on the wall. So, or with children, you can get children to hold it up or whatever, but it's the perfect thing because it's absolutely systematic, and all you're doing is reminding them that this is what's, you know, this is how the rule works. So I've always found that to be successful enough. The next two are the two that we saw with the speaker you just did. The rules here at the bottom of 399 and are the same example, similar examples. So the rules are slightly different, but you still have the three. In fact, the rules here are easier. The ud, it only is when it's following a t or a d, and then the d for voiced, following voiced, and the t for following unvoiced. So again, one of the critical things here that learners get confused by if they're highly literate is the orthography, which we'll look more at next week. But so take a word like hope, where it's H-O-P-E. So then students think that that ends with an E. So that ends with a voice sound. But they can't say hoped. So they tend to say hoped, right? Because they think, where in fact, if you say hope, it ends with a P, right? Which is a voiceless sound. So it's hoped, right? So again, this is the kind of help that you want to give them. Not, again, for highly literate learners, this is always a problem. They look at it and they say, oh, this ends in a voice, even if they've got the rule, they know the rule, they say it ends in a voice sound because they see the voice sound in the orthography rather than listening for how it actually ends. So again, it's another one that you can stick on the wall and you can say, again, slightly more confusing in the sense that, you know, if you heard hers, analyze, you know, if you read it, she was reading it from a piece of paper, and she was obviously pretty literate. I mean very literate. So she won't think of the word as ending in that sibilant sound necessarily, sound. So analyze it, you know, but in fact it's analyzed. So that's the kind of thing that you're looking for. It's not necessarily a problem if it occurs occasionally, and if there are no other epenthetic vowel problems. You know, I think I've told you that Dr. Charlo does it quite a lot. He just gets it wrong. I don't really know why. But I think he's been getting it wrong for so long now that it just comes out that way. And it's never an intelligibility problem with him because he has virtually no epenthetic vowels at all. So you know that he's just saying confirmed, and it doesn't matter. Now, in the case of the speaker that you had, she had a real problem. She had epenthetic vowels all over the place. So she was forever making a vowel sound. So for her, maybe slightly more important that you work on that as it's contributing to that extra vowel sound. But as I say, if it doesn't, you know, if it's occurring every once in a while, but it's really not a big thing, then that would be an intelligibility issue that might be much lower than other intelligibility issues. So, for example, with this chick that we just did, that would be lower on my thing than this vowels issue. You know, you could understand without looking at the transcript that she was saying washed and stressed and confirmed. But as I say, there was no way you would know she was saying goose. No way in heaven. So really work on looking at, so this one would only be a priority for her in the sense, as I say, that it's contributing to this epenthetic vowel issue. All right, and that takes care of your past tense for regular verbs and your past participles. Again, doesn't matter that they're different grammar, they're the same phoneme with the same underlying allophones. Present participle, your ing ending, your ing ending, is not affected in the same way, right? We don't sort of say ang or ong, we always say ing. However, we usually say in, okay? So we say thinking, doing, right? We don't say doing, thinking, right? Unless we're using emphatic stress, in which case then we often go back towards the citation form. So if I said I was thinking, not I was sinking. Okay, so even then I'm not really saying ing, I'm sort of saying in. Yeah, I said I was thinking, not sinking. So it's typically pronounced as in, right? Now, there are some dialects in the UK, and I have to say, I'd be interested if anybody knows any dialects here in the US that do this. I don't know enough about American dialects, but there's some dialects in the USA, in the UK, in the north, and in central England, where they sort of say a double end. So they say thinking, thinking, and you get a little g on the end. So it says, I was thinking, and you hear that little end sound. It's very common in Birmingham, and it's also common some places in the north, where they say this. So if your learner is saying something like that, it's worth asking if their teacher was from the UK, from somewhere up north. It is absolutely a dialectal feature. It shouldn't be too much of a, if they say thinking, it shouldn't be too much. But again, it depends on how good that g is at the end. If that g is really a full-blown epenthetic schwa, like it's not just g, but it's g, with a, or gur, so thinking with an on the end of it, then you've got a problem, right? So it's the difference between having that extra little sound, so thinking versus thinking, which that could be sound like an additional vowel. Yeah, does anyone know of any dialects in America that do that? I don't think I've ever heard of any, but you never know. All right, and that just leaves us with comparatives and superlatives. So you can see this on table 11.3 on 4.5 on 405. Okay, so you've got a big old table there on 405 of everything that happens with s, and your choice of more or a suffix. There's no morphophonological based change here either, but the choices of which strategy to use historically are phonologically based, because they're based in number of syllables, right? So you say happier, but because it's happy to happier, 2 to 3, but you say beautiful to more beautiful instead of beautifuler, right? Because there's more syllables. Now, that said, I have noticed that more and more people are not following those rules, that more and more people are taking words like curious, pleasant, well, pleasant doesn't surprise me, but curious, beautiful, and adding the suffix instead. Now the one that so I looked on Youglish, the Youglish, I don't know if this is going to come up here. Let me see if this comes up here. Hold on 1 second. Here we go.
Or in, so you can get more and see beautiful things. Like the path if it's a path, it could lead you to a beach or something, and it could be beautiful.
So I don't know if you heard her, but she said beautifuler things. So instead of more beautiful. And if you look at curious, this is really funny. If you look at curiouser, you get Alice in Wonderland.
Curiouser and curiouser, said Alice. She was very surprised, and for a minute she forgot how to speak good English.
So that is actually from Alice in Wonderland. I don't know how many of you know that book, but it's sort of amusing the way he's like, the author's like, oh, she forgot how to speak good English because she says curiouser and curiouser. Now, I have to say, based on my own perception of hearing people do this, I thought I'd find a lot of examples of this, and I didn't. I found this one from Curiouser, which was deliberately made up, and the beautifuler one obviously is a kid. So we would expect some, she's probably just extending the rule at the moment because she's so young. But I still stand by the fact that I think this is changing. And I think that more and more people are using things like curiouser and beautifuler than saying more beautiful. So I would love for you to keep your ear out for anything that you hear along those lines with any of those words, where you listen to it and it jars, sort of, because you're like, wait, shouldn't that be more curious or more beautiful? Hold on. So if you hear anything like that, I would super love to have you tell me. Yeah.
Dr. Pickering, can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yes, Sarah.
I feel like I hear the opposite. Now, I teach 8th grade reading. So they're native English speakers and they're 13, 14, 15, depending on the kid. But more often than not, I think they're afraid to say, like, even cleaner, they'll say more clean. Or dirtier, they'll say more dirty. I hear that a lot more in my kids.
Oh, how
and I think it's because, like, more or most is always a word, and clean or dirty is always a word. So they're afraid to get it wrong.
Sarah, it could be hypercorrection.
Yeah,
meaning
that's just
they're so worried that they can't say or est. They just put more or most on everything. It's a form of hypercorrection. It's like a grammatical hypercorrection, like you say you and I instead of you and me, right? That's a form of grammatical hypercorrection. Nobody knows whether it should be you or me or you or I, so they always go for the more posh one, which is you and I, when it should in fact be you and me. But so this would be a form of phonological hypercorrection, which is fascinating. So I am going to write that down. Thank you very much. Now, do you bother correcting them, Sarah? Do you say, actually it should be dirtier?
I might in like a recast, but it just depends on how it comes into the conversation. Since I also teach virtually, a lot of it will come in through, they'll submit an assignment online and I'll see it. And so I might make a comment, but Lord knows if they ever open my feedback or not. So
I hear you.
Because again, they're 13, 14, and 15, so they don't want to do an extra step of opening something up. But if it's in a live class, like what we do in Zoom, and they say it like, oh, I thought that was, that car looked more dirty than that car. I might say, oh, so you think the first car is dirtier?
Dirtier, right?
Usually, like I'll just recast it.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I mean, I think I would be the same. I mean, it's clearly not, I mean, who cares really, to be honest? I mean, especially if the rules are shifting, which I think they are, then, I don't, but that's great. That's great. I will add that now to my my list of stuff that happens. All right, let me get out of here. What did I do? Oh yeah, you can still see that superlatives and comparatives thing. Excellent. So good. Thank you, Sarah. I will add that on. So that is basically what your chapter spends a lot of time talking about, and most of its time talking about, and gives you a ton of exercises and things that you can play with. So again, this is how I would use this textbook. You've just done this assessment of your speaker like we just did with the Mexican speaker, and now you say, okay, now I'm going to start prioritizing vowels, including epenthetic vowels, which will include work on, you know, endings, morphological endings. Then this, then this, then this, then this. And then when you've made that decision, you've made that assessment decision, you can go to your text and say, okay, what are some good exercises and stuff that I can use to do that now I've made that determination. All right, derivational morphology, as you know, is everything else, basically. And your book focuses on just a couple of things. We've already looked at stems, roots, affixes, and compounds, right, when we looked at our connected speech chapter. So there's a lot of overlap here between the connected speech chapter and this chapter, because when you do derivational morphology, you have a lot of suffixation, so there's a lot of shifts in stress, right? Compounding is also considered a form of derivational morphology, so again, that comes with shifts in stress. So White House versus White House, electric versus electrician, so the suffix shifts the stress. And then the other thing we looked at was progressive assimilation in prefixes. So when you, so the underlying prefix is in or un, and then if its phonological environment is just before a bilabial, it will change to im, so impossible, okay. Bilabial matching and so on. So we've looked at that. We looked at that in connected speech, and as I say, that's a little overlap. They add a few more examples here that have to do with sort of morphology categories and what happens if you turn things into different word classes. So this is sort of morphosyntactic morphophonology, because it's sort of a bit of both. Just goes to show you, by the way, that everything is all kind of like smushed in together. So you've got relationships between nouns and verbs that often change the voiceless to voice. So use versus use. So one use, the noun, versus to use, the verb. You've got relationships between verbs and adjectives. So like I learned versus he is learned. Although I think, to be honest, that's beginning to change too. That's sounds very old fashioned to me now. But then you've got a slightly more tricky, which is very few, and your book concentrates on a couple of the most productive ones. Productive meaning most likely to appear in your students' general vocabulary, like not sort of esoteric or something they're never likely to see or say. So this one is the 8 suffix. So duplicate is the verb, and then the noun gets pushed down to cut, so duplicate. Yeah, there you go. So depending upon whether it's the verb or the noun, they have different pronunciations. This is particularly strong in words like separate. So I separate the garbage, because you wouldn't say I separate the garbage, right? But the adjective, you always say separate. You don't say a separate person, you say a separate person. So that 8 goes all the way down to practically nothing. So those kinds of things, again, can throw your learners, in the sense that we tend to spend a lot of time on orthography. And by the time they've learned about derivation and suffixes and prefixes, then they start getting quite confused with the phonology. So again, you know, make the assessment yourself. And if you decide, you know, if someone says it's a separate thing instead of it's a separate thing, all right? So you're using, so don't worry about that, that's a separate thing, rather than don't worry about that, that's a separate thing, right? To me, who cares? You know, it still sounds intelligible. You know, it's one of our best friends always teases Sal because he says basically instead of basically, right? And she teases him, you know, she teases him. I know when they go home they say, oh, did you hear Sal say that again? Every time he says it, she grins at me. But you know, it's not an intelligibility issue, right? So again, pick your battles depending upon the assessment that you have done of the learner. All right, so a final note, as you can see from this chapter, there are a lot, you know, like just the table, this last table on comparatives and superlatives, you could be sitting there for forever looking at those rules. So, because there are a lot that are predictable, but of course it depends on the, so, you know, there's a lot of predictable, which we didn't look at, but there's a lot of predictable rules for irregular verbs, like where you go mouse to mice, or, and it depends on the historical origin of the word and so on. But once you look at all that little group of words together, they all do the same thing. So they can be learned. But as usual, there's a, you know, you don't want to just like go to your students and say, okay, today we're going to learn all the possible morphophonetic processes there are with irregular verbs, depending upon whether they come from German or whether they come from Latin, or, you know, I mean, this is not the way to go about it, right? The way to go about it is to prioritize what you want. Start clearly with an intelligibility problem, or a persistent or an annoying problem that your student you think would want to address if they knew, or in fact that your student has brought to you and said, I know I'm doing this, how do I stop this, right? So a Spanish speaker with an epenthetic school or something like that, that they've noticed that something's wrong, right? So start there and work with that and see, you know, help them to understand that it's systematic, so they can fix it, but you don't want to necessarily give them everything on the planet. Then, as I said, use this textbook, hold on to this textbook, because once you've identified that problem, you can use it as a resource for diagnosing it and then finding activities that you can do. Of course, there are also a million other places now that you can find activities, all the things that you've been looking at, all the electronic resources, manythings.org, etc., etc. So that's the way to go about doing it. All right, well, it was a pretty short chapter, so I didn't really have anything else. So now it's a question of whether you guys had any questions or comments or things you wanted to talk about for me based on that chapter. So everything seemed pretty straightforward to you guys? Good. It should be. It shouldn't be. But let me know if you do. So your reading post, you have are going to do some question answers from 1 to 5 under in the classroom. And then for your activity, okay, I'm going to stop share temporarily. And then I'm going to start share again. Okay. Let's go up here. Share screen. Okay, you should be able to see attending to word stress while learning new vocabulary. Excellent. Thank you for that heads up. It really is helpful. So this is my friend John Murphy, who you'll now only ever think of as a yoga teacher, I'm sure, but who's done this fabulous work, lots and lots of fabulous work if you look up his stuff. But this is one thing that he was particularly proud of. He developed his own way. We were working at Georgia State. He developed his own system of trying to help learners understand and work out word stress. So it starts out with several months ago, I was standing in line at the university's cafeteria, that'd be Georgia State, waiting to place a lunch order. I heard an animated voice say, "Oh, teacher, how do you say hippopotama?" I turned and realized I was being addressed by a former student from the Ivory Coast. Jean-Paul, good to see you. I was thinking of you because I don't know how to say that word. Well, you remember what we used to do in class, right? Says John. Okay, I think so. So he says, how many syllables does it have? Jean-Paul counts them out on his fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's a 5-syllable word. So which one do you think is the stressed syllable, says John. He says the second one. He says, no, it's not actually the second one. So it's hippopotamus, right? So this makes it a 5-3 word. So this is the way he taught it. Now he tells us all, this is why he wrote this article. He tells us all he had great success with this particular idea of teaching word stress. So he could say to the students, so in other words, again, instead of recasting, you could have the students work it out for themselves. So if the student says hippopotamus, well, actually, okay, let's use the hypothesis that I like. So hypothesis, so you would say to the student, that is a 4-2 word. So you're saying it wrong. So then the student would have to try and work out. So it would say, right, there's 4 syllables, hypothesis, but it's a 2-4-2 stress word. So hypothesis, and then hopefully they'd get to hypothesis, right? So anyway, I want you to read the article because it's a nice little article. Then I want you to, she says, I'm going back to the lecture. Sorry, Sarah, for some reason we get you all the time when I share screen. Okay. Share screen. Can you, okay, so you can see that again. So you're going to go to the article. The paper reports on a technique he developed to teach word stress to learners. Read the paper, and then if you can, so Liliana, it's time to drag out your dad again. Read the paper, try it out on an English language learner and see how they like it, and then report your findings, okay? If there's no language learner in your environment, which is fine, see if you can test it out on a colleague, if you can. But you know, it would be ideally it would be a language teacher, one of your language teacher colleagues, who understands that, you know, learners have this word stress issue, and tell me whether they like this idea or not. Whether they think it's a workable idea or not a workable idea. So and that's your activity for this week. All right, and I am done with you this week, unless anyone has anything they want to add. Does anyone have anything they want to add? All right, then in that case, thank you for your hypercorrection thing, Sarah. I'm gonna add that in for from now, because that's so interesting to me. Yeah. And I am going to stop recording, but if you'd like to talk to me, just stay on the line. I'm not going anywhere. Okay, otherwise I will see you next week. Bye bye.
Bye, Dr. Pickering.
Bye.